Well, yeah, I just wanted to welcome everyone to our event today and to thank you all for being here. I wanted to particularly thank our sponsors, Penn Engineering, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the School of Arts and Sciences at Penn, and the LGBT Center, as well as, I believe, Marta, the Vagelos Institute. Are they supposed to be on here?
I
No.
don't believe so, no.
I'm getting out of my lane. I'm just going to stop there then. But I was reflecting a little bit this morning about the event as I walked in, and just thinking about how trans people and queer people generally, I'm feeling like, are especially kind of under attack at the moment across the country, in different parts of the country, let's say. And it's a really disquieting feeling, and something that makes me sad. So it's events like this that really, I think, are essential and important in Pride Month, to remind us, and I can mute that. There we go. Thank you. That remind us and renew for us the essential importance of allyship, especially for our trans siblings. So I want to wish everyone a wonderful Pride. And Irving, I'm really looking forward to your remarks, and I want to thank everyone for being here, and again, thank our sponsors. So Marta, I'll pass it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, so it's really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Irving Redding from Reed College. And Irving is not only an excellent scientist, but a great person, and really have enjoyed getting to know them. So just by way of introduction, Dr. Irving Redding is an inorganic chemist and a transgender activist in the STEM fields. He received his bachelor's degree in chemistry from Pitzer College in 2014. Completed his PhD in inorganic photochemistry in 2021 at Portland State University, and is currently working as a postdoctoral researcher at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Dr. Redding is a founding member of the Name Change Policy Working Group, a group comprised of transgender and genderqueer academics and cisgender allies that collaborates with journals and publishers to adopt more inclusive name change policies on publications that better accommodate transgender authors. He's also a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics subgroup on name change policies, which is developing new guidance on name change policies for all 12,000 plus of its member journals. He's personally overseen the development of name change policies with ACS, IOP, Wiley, and more. Irving, it is really, really wonderful to have you here. We're just delighted to hear what you have to say, and you can go ahead to share your slides and share with us your message.
Great, thanks so much. Give me just a second to get all that set up. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see that? Looks great. Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Marta. I also had a little intro slide, but I can go through that kind of quickly. Like Marta just said, so I'm a chemist. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Reed College, but I did my bachelor's in Southern California, near where I'm from, which is San Diego, and then took 2 years off in between my undergrad and grad school. I worked as a contract chemist, first for a pharmaceutical lab, and then with a materials identification group at a museum in Los Angeles. And then in 2016 was when I joined the Portland State University Chemistry Department, and finished my PhD, right smack in the middle of the pandemic, which was an interesting experience. Outside of research, really most of my time is dedicated to these two. These are my dogs, Bowie and Jeff. And we like to explore all of the different ecosystems of the Pacific Northwest. So that middle picture is a waterfall that's in Umpqua National Forest. And then there's a tiny Jeff on top of a big pile of rocks out near Smith Rock State Park. And before I get started, like, Eric was mentioning, this talk is really focused on, some of the more subversive ways that assumptions and stereotypes about gender, affect, really anybody, transgender and cisgender people alike, but there are some very overt oppressive forces at work in our country that are extremely alarming. You know, when Marta first asked me to do this talk a little less than 2 months ago, you know, this number of anti-LGBTQ bills has now surpassed over 300 that have been proposed or passed. You know, I feel like every 2 weeks, you know, some state has surpassed the last in the, you know, how in the immensely restrictive or severe levels of punishment, you know, for providing gender affirming care to youth, or for allowing trans women or trans feminine people to participate in sports, you know, and not surprising to the transgender community, but that has been, you know, voiced as a surprise by everybody else, is that, you know, we are now starting to see the first waves of rollbacks of gender affirming care for all trans patients, which includes adults. Florida has just proposed a bill to remove Medicaid coverage of gender affirming care, which, you know, in that case affects, you know, the most vulnerable of the trans population. In that map of the US, all of those red states are states that have passed anti-trans bills in the last 3 years. Those increasing in color indicate, you know, less than 5 to 10 or greater, or 15 or greater bills that have been passed. And right now, most of them encompass restricting specifically trans women from being able to access restrooms, locker rooms, and playing the sport that fits with their gender identity. But that we're seeing an increasing number of restrictions on access to healthcare by trans people, which I think is, you know, extremely alarming, and it puts into perspective, you know, the consequences of you know, an entire political party that has decided to mobilize against trans people, and I don't really want to sugarcoat it, because that's what it is. You know, but I think that you know, trans people and allies are really powerful, and I think that this sort of legislation is just a show of a dying opinion, but it just happens to be one that has a lot of power right now. And if we, you know, come together as a community, if we listen to trans people about the very specifics that they need around advocating in politics, you know, we can overcome this. So going back to my presentation, I want to just make sure that everyone's on the same page, you know, with some of the terminology that I'm going to be using today. And so I just wanted to throw up a couple of vocabulary terms. I'm not going to just read these word for word, so you're welcome to read these yourself if you like, or if you're unfamiliar with certain words. But really, I think, you know, the most important thing about this kind of vocabulary is that, you know, an individual gets to define their own gender in their own words on their own terms always. And it's important for, you know, for us as allies of an individual, whether or not, you know, we identify as trans, if we're cis, if we're non-binary, you know, that we respect those things. And I want to start with an anecdote about my own journey through gender. So this is me circa 2001, still in elementary school. You know, I was what most parents and kids referred to as a tomboy. I preferred to wear boys' clothes. My favorite place was on the soccer field or running around the track. You know, I was mostly friends with boys in my school. And, you know, looking back, this was really the first time that I recognized that I was different. You know, I would remember being really confused about why I was not a boy. You know, and it was never something that I really said out loud, but I thought it a lot. And, you know, without the language or the access to information about trans people, I had a hard time understanding my own gender. You know, and so I let those thoughts come and go as I tried to focus on school and athletics. But as I inched closer to puberty, you know, and I wasn't growing out of my tomboy phase, I started getting increasingly persistent about what I wanted to look like. And my parents, who also didn't have any access to information about, about transgender children, got increasingly worried that I was going to get bullied in middle school and high school. And so when I graduated the 5th grade, they made the decision to make themselves responsible for choosing what I wore and how I looked on a daily basis. And that they only chose feminine clothes. They didn't know. I didn't know. They were trying to act, in a way that they saw as preventing me from experiencing harm. But in fact, that those actions really negatively impacted my mental health. I thought that I had just pulled the losing card with gender, and I just accepted that I would never look on the outside how I felt on the inside. So fast forward 15 years, it's 2016, and I had just joined the Portland State University chemistry department as an incoming PhD student. Shortly after moving to Portland, I came out as transgender to my friends, and then to my larger professional sphere about a year later when I started hormone replacement therapy. I think that I have a really unique experience, which is going through a gender transition during grad school, that I think has allowed me to see and better understand the ways that gender biases exist within the STEM fields and academia as a whole. I think the best way to describe my experience is through the lens of my organic chemistry students, though. The majority of my students were cisgender and, function within the lens of cis normativity, which meant that when I would walk into a classroom, depending on the year, students would assume that I was a cisgender woman or a cisgender man, unless I outed myself. And let me tell you, it is quite different being perceived as one or the other. And I think that, really where I saw that was in feedback from students that I got from teaching evaluations. So in my first few years of teaching, this was overwhelmingly, folks thought I was a good teacher, but in addition to that, I got a lot of comments about how I was too intense and unapproachable, that I always seemed really angry and I was always really loud. And that was very distinctly when I was perceived by my students as a cisgender woman. But after a few years on testosterone, I was still teaching the same exact class, just a different round of students. And my teaching technique hadn't really changed very much. But suddenly the narrative that students were giving back to me about my performance had shifted. That suddenly those same attributes that were perceived as intense and loud were then perceived as intelligent and knowledgeable, commanding of a room and passionate. I was flooded with these compliments from students, and I was outraged, that nothing had changed but their perception of me. And I have this perspective, but as do countless others who have transitioned, in some sort of public setting. We have the ability to see these invisible strings that dictate our society that's based on assumptions about gender identity. And in order to make space for trans people to thrive, academia and STEM have to start listening to these stories. I want to continue with a quote from poet and media activist Malkaya Surreal, which is that technologies reflect the biases of the makers and implicit rules of society. So the biases of the makers and implicit rules of society, manifest as assumptions about who is accessing research and technology. And it's when those assumptions about a population are incorrect or not representative of the entire population that we start to see a massive divide between those who benefit from research and technology and those who are harmed by it. And this exists outside of just chemistry. And it also goes beyond assumptions about gender and sexual orientation. For example, ableism is the assumption that everybody is similarly abled, aka not disabled. And in technology, ableist assumptions are rampant through almost all online interfaces. There's an organization called Web Accessibility in Mind that does an annual review of the top 1 million most visited websites on the internet. And year after year, it finds that over 90% of them have major accessibility issues. For example, websites might not consider people who have a visual impairment when they're designing their user interface. So fonts are too small, or the contrast between fonts and the background are not distinguishable enough for a lot of people to be able to read. Another example of assumptions about a population surface with race bias in technology. And I think that was, an example of that that had massive implications was with hand motion technology. And as made its way across the globe, there were thousands of individuals who started reporting that hand soap dispensers and faucets and fitness trackers couldn't detect their dark skin. They could only detect light skin because the researchers only sampled from light skin populations. They didn't consider that they needed to include dark skin in the development of their product. And though much of this technology was repaired because of outrage from the community, the inherent bias was not addressed as a whole and has shown up in other areas. Like, for example, in recent years, the first iterations of the self-driving car, which couldn't detect dark-skinned people walking across the street. And then finally, a pretty clear example of sort of gendered assumptions and cisnormativity, that has manifested in technology is TSA scanners. Wherein if the gender of that the TSA assignment agent assigned you, just by giving you a quick once-over, doesn't match the example scan of a cisgender woman or a cisgender man, you are flagged and you're taken aside and searched, which is the literal policing of trans bodies. In fact, I just had a friend who came and visited, and she was astonished that she only got flagged once coming through security. These assumptions and biases are everywhere, and it's our job as human beings that are currently living today, who have agreed that all of our colleagues and coworkers and friends and family members, deserve equal access to the benefits of research and technology, to notice these assumptions and to actively work to change them. And so along this line of cisnormativity, I want to get us thinking about, how we can identify these assumptions and then how we can enact the changes that are necessary to dismantle them. And so the biggest incorrect assumption that we all encounter all day, every day, is that everyone is cisgender. So revisiting this definition, cisgender means denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity or gender corresponds with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So let's say if a researcher, who develops a piece of technology is cisgender, but they've only ever interacted with other cisgender researchers who have only ever known other cisgender people, then that research and the resulting technology reflects the assumptions of that maker. But these types of assumptions don't exclusively affect trans people. They affect everyone. I think that the intersection of feminism and gender justice is really interesting and something I feel really passionate about, because it's the ways in which assumptions of cisnormativity are oppressive to all genders. These assumptions manifest as expectations and stereotypes of the ways that a cisgender man and a cisgender woman should act, which in fact is not based on biology, but in an entirely socially constructed categorization. They lead to assumptions about appearance, resource access, knowledge, needs, and aid, that ultimately have the most detrimental impact on the trans community. And it's, the way to reference this system of oppression that is developed from a social construct is the status quo. So the status quo is defined as the existing state of affairs, often one that's not questioned or tampered with, and was established by a specific demographic, and serves only a specific demographic. In addressing the status quo, we're not just talking about, adding a few more policies, changing a bathroom sign, adding a new box to tick on the list of gender selections. We're not just talking about, putting pronoun pins on people and calling it good. We are trying to dismantle the status quo. And the reason why is because you cannot simultaneously support trans people while maintaining the status quo. And the status quo often doesn't serve a lot of people. It doesn't serve me. It doesn't serve your colleagues. It doesn't serve your friends. And so if you say that you're on board with all of this, what you're trying to do is work with those of us who have the ability to clearly see the status quo and usually have to suffer because of it, and make change. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about a very specific way in which this assumption has affected the larger STEM research community. And that's in the publishing sector. And this is where I've done a lot of work in my activism in the STEM fields. And so what stems from the assumption that all people is cisgender in the publishing world is that no one in academic publishing needs to change their name. And I want you to think about this for just a second, because there's actually, if we're talking about the research community as a whole, there actually is a large group of cisgender people who do change their name and would need to change their name on a published article. And that's cisgender people who get married, the majority of which are women. So if the sort of accepted status quo is that, no one in publishing changes their name, so no one needs to retroactively change their name on papers, what does that say about the gender diversity of the policymakers themselves? I want to quote Dr. Tess Tannenbaum from University of Irvine, who has worked with me on implementing a lot of these new name change policies. And she said one time in a meeting that, if cisgender men had to change their name after they were married, that we wouldn't have this problem. And so I want to reiterate that this kind of discrimination doesn't stem from malicious intent. There weren't people who were, actively thinking about, how can they, oppress certain people, but just from a lack of understanding about the needs of others because of the lack of diverse voices at the table. So the implication of this, or who upholds this ethics policy in the publishing world, is an organization called COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission it is to define best practices in ethics of scholarly publishing, and then to assist editors, authors, publishers, and journals in achieving this goal. COPE has over 12,000 publishers and journals as members, which includes every single journal title you can think of or are familiar with. And so then these journals and publishers default to COPE's case rulings to dictate how they shape their own policies. This power, coupled to the lack of trans representation within COPE, has led to some of the harmful assumptions that we're discussing today. That people don't change their name, and if they do, other than for marriage, it's an attempt to be unethical, to change the public record in a way that's malicious, which is overwhelmingly untrue. Due to a ruling by COPE in 2013, which really just hammered down how much power they had in upholding this policy by denying individuals requests for name changes for lots of different reasons. For a long time, journals and publishers were unwilling to take feedback from the trans community because putting out a new policy that contradicted COPE's guidance would put the journals in a legally compromising position. So until 2019, the policy held firm, and no publishers allowed trans authors to update their names on previously published papers. I encountered this issue in graduate school when my first research paper as a co-author was published with my dead name. It was before I had changed my name, before I had come out publicly. And as I had progressed through my graduate career, I was getting more and more frustrated that I had to have this disclaimer on my CV or emails that, I promise this is my work. Please don't go fishing for my dead name. I had to change it on this publication, and I'm sending it to you with a black box because I don't want you to see it. But here you go. Because the other option was just to exclude a paper from my CV, which as a graduate student, then, having a large publication record really is the difference between getting and not getting a job. And it was frustrating also to know that my name had been cited multiple times, and that there were lots of people in my community who had, or outside of my community, who had seen my dead name. But when I asked about getting it changed, I got the answer that a lot of other trans people had gotten before me, which was that it's just not possible. To which I called BS. And it turns out that there were a handful of other transgender authors who felt similarly. And it was from that shared frustration and drive to create change that we formed the Name Change Policy Working Group. And once we formed this group, we set out to do the work. We started by giving talks at our individual departments or scientific society meetings, wrote articles, editorials, and opinion pieces, and then turned to social media to push our message out even further. And then after nearly 2 years of doing this, we got through to a few small journals at first, but then some major publishers, in convincing them to go against COPE's guidance and change their policies. And, once some of these big ones started making announcements, that really catalyzed a whole movement wherein, these policies, these changes to these policies really took off. So Wiley, the American Chemical Society, F1000 Research, the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Institute of Physics Publishing, Nature, the American Psychological Association, eLife, Science Magazine, and so many more, decided that it was worth it to abandon COPE's ruling in policy and work with the Trans Name Change Policy Group to rewrite their own individual policies in a manner that removes barriers towards academic publishing. And the collective pressure from this organizing then led to the biggest opportunity of all, which was a seat at the table with COPE. And so that's when we formed this subcommittee and met with board members of COPE to address this issue. And they just flat out apologized for the harm that they had caused and made a commitment to work with us to publish a new set of guidelines on post-publication name changes. And this has been going on for almost 2 years now, but the new draft should be scheduled to be released by the end of this year, which is really exciting. The guiding principles that were established, which I think, are can be used as a watermark for a lot of other policies, are accessibility, comprehensiveness, invisibility, expediency, and simplicity, and recurrence and maintenance, which, as a whole just means that, that these resources should be made available to anybody and everybody who wants to use them. They should be thorough and comprehensive, changing names, in all places that the journal or publisher is capable of doing so, that there not be attention drawn to the dead name, that it is simple and fast for the author to be able to do, and that it's revisited, that, we make sure that this person's dead name is not continually disseminated throughout the public record. So all of this has been accomplished, and I am happy to chat with anybody who is interested in getting and knowing whether or not a journal that they have a paper in can have their name changed on. But where do we go from here if this has been accomplished? Well, one of the things that we've encountered while going to change these policies is that there are just some really massive roadblocks, either on the front end or back end of things, that have to do with the original development of online publishing. And what the question we're really trying to answer now is, how can we grant full author autonomy over a name being changed? Right now it still is a lot of work to go through individual journals to get this sort of thing accomplished. But is there a way to divorce, this idea that a name is unchanging and therefore can be used as a constant, from the publishing world? Because in fact, it is not a immovable variable. It is one that changes. And so having something like a publishing ID, like your ORCID ID, or even an author name DOI, that can be used to plug in place where your name would go, but then a watermark of whatever name you choose can be then in the foreground, is really what we're looking at. And as frightening as it is for a lot of publishers to admit, what that means is overhauling the system. But when you consider that publishing only moved online a decade ago, it sort of makes sense that it's time for an overhaul. But then looking macroscopically, really what needs to happen is for there to be more queer and trans voices, in all levels at which policies are implemented, in academia and in STEM. And that involves recruitment and retention. And so I want to break this down into a few components, because, as even though it's important to fight to retroactively change policies that are actively harmful, we really, what we want is, to achieve gender diversity at all levels. And, that is really truly the meaning of gender justice. So on the individual level, it's working to actively dismantle your own assumptions about gender. I think that one really excellent way of doing this that, is not just for cisgender allies, but it is also for trans and non-binary people, is that you really have to work against this societal programming. Just because you come out as transgender or non-binary doesn't mean that you have not been programmed to see gender in a certain way because of, the society in which you were raised. And I try to do this once a day, which is that you see somebody at a grocery store or crossing the street, or, maybe somebody even on campus, and you make a conscious effort to tell yourself that you do not know that person's gender. You cannot assume anything about how they identify themselves based on your visual inspection. And, this is something that it takes years to reprogram your brain to not automatically assign man and woman to people. But I think it is really, really important and, really the most effective way of doing so. Some individual resources, which I'm also going to be sending out at the end of this talk, are, this, I have intended for this talk to not really be a trans 101 talk, because trans people don't really want to sit through a trans 101 talk. And I didn't want to assume that everybody in this group is cisgender, partially because I know that not everybody in this group is cisgender. But it is really important that you take time to attend talks that are led by trans people, specifically directed at educating cisgender people. And the reason why is because then when you enter discussions about transness, about gender with transgender people, if you know, and if you've been educated on the ways in which you might accidentally say something incredibly harmful, you won't do that, and you will be able to be re-invited to the spaces where trans people are talking about their experiences. I was actually considering having a discussion section of this presentation, but, was reminded that I don't know what folks' level of education is, and I don't want to to accidentally subject any of the trans people that are in this Zoom call to unnecessary harm. And so that's why we are just reflecting for today. There are Trans 101 almost in every DEI department, at a university or DEI office at a university. They have worked with any sort of LGBTQ group on campus, any sort of LGBTQ resource center on campus to develop workshops for individuals or even for departments. I think that there's a really, really good kind of quick Trans 101 podcast from a podcast that's called This Podcast is Queer. That's just called Trans 101. It's one of their first episodes. It's episode 4. I also really, really encourage folks to ContraPoints, again, is it's a YouTube channel from a trans woman who discusses lots and lots of things about transness and transgender, anti-transgender policies or anti-trans figureheads, and really breaks down, the ways in which you can sort of form your own opinion about these individuals and understand the ways in which they are oppressive to trans people. I think that her episode on J.K. Rowling is phenomenal. Also, she's just a really great curator of media in general. She wears this long white wedding gown in a bath full of rose petals as she's giving these talks. That is just wildly entertaining. Usually also with a whiskey, if that sways any particular individuals here, because I know we really like whiskey at the CSSM. And in addition to that, PFLAG is an organization that's parents and friends of queer folks. And they have a lot of great resources, including a workshop that you can either get the brochure for free, or you can contact them about getting a training on through a incentive called Straight for Equity. And it discusses the ways in which you can implement inclusive policies in a lot of different spaces. At the departmental and organizational levels, again, the PFLAG's Straight for Equity workshops, they have some that are specifically geared towards organizations as well as individuals who you can hire in order to give those trainings. The Harvard Business Review has a really great pamphlet on creating a trans inclusive workspace that I think is updated really regularly, and I often go to it to make sure that the places in which I'm working have the most updated inclusive policies available. And then along the lines of getting workshops, inviting and then also paying transgender and non-binary researchers, to come to your department seminars to give talks, about their research. Don't assume that every trans person is going to want to talk about trans issues. That has happened to me a couple of times. And when I say that I'm a PhD scientist that does research, most of the time that they assume that I'm researching trans health. But I am extremely squeamish, and so I researched solar panel technology instead. And then within your department, distributing campus resources, consolidating campus resources for transgender people and disseminating that throughout the entire department. Because like I said, you might know some out trans people in your departments or in your organizations, but trans people don't owe you the knowledge of them, that they don't have to out themselves to you. Especially if you've never done any of these this personal work for, making yourself a safe space for trans folks, that, that you might not realize just how many trans people you're surrounded by. And so those are some resources that are for, all of the allies that are here today, but I also wanted to provide some resources for my fellow trans and non-binary folks that are here. Whoop, whoop. You can contact me via my school email, which is iredig@reed, or my personal email, which I have up here. Also, feel free to send me DMs on Twitter. And I also have quite a few pinned resources for the Trans Name Change Policy Resource Group, including a list of journals that have updated their name change policies. On Facebook, there's a group that's called the Trans PhD Network, a group of trans academics from all different backgrounds, sharing resources, conferences, talks, workshops that I think are really amazing. And then these two QR codes, which if you just like hold your phone up to the screen and take a picture of them, one of them is to Dr. Tess Tannenbaum's Nature article, which was sort of the one that really blew up the scene of name change policies, and then the name change policy working group website as well. And then on the right side, I've got just a couple of organizations that have queer STEM conferences. So one of them is Out to Innovate, which I attended a summit for in 2019. They happen every 2 years. If you have not been to a queer science conference and you are a queer person, I 100% recommend going to one of these, Out to Innovate or OSTEM. They are just really phenomenal. It is so great to be super gay at a science conference. Yeah, I mean, that's it. It's really great to be gay at a gay science conference. And then 500 Queer Scientists, which is an organization that's consolidating the stories of queer scientists, for increased visibility. And I think it's just, it's really heartwarming to just scroll through the stories of queer scientists that from all around the globe who are being activists by just existing in these fields. And then last, I just want to give some shout outs to people who, have been really formative in some of this activism work. Dr. Tess Tannenbaum, Lisa Petcher, Jess Rucker, Ben Hall, John Pincus, and Nancy Williams, as well as the entire name change policy working group, and lots of other folks who really helped me to evolve as an individual in all of this. And then with that, as I stand strongly behind my belief that professionalism is oppression, I always end all presentations with a meme. And so here's a meme that is on the left, encompasses the research that I'm doing right now. And then the right is some of my trans activism. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Okay, Irving, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We're very grateful for that. And I want to be cognizant of your comment about the potential to do harm in the discussion section, but I'm grateful that you have offered to take questions. And so perhaps if folks have questions for you about your particular activism work around name change in the literature or other aspects that we can be aware are not going to do harm, then they should chime in.
Yeah, and then also if you do have a question that you're not sure is one that is appropriate for this setting where there are queer and trans folks in this group, I like to do a lot of calling in, and so I'm happy to answer individual questions via email. I'll go ahead and just drop my email again in the chat. And I'm happy to talk with you about stuff, because I really think that it is with, forming these personal relationships, that we can have these conversations in a way that then helps you be able to enter a space safely.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we saw your email there at the end of the slides, but if you have a moment and you can type it in the chat, that would also be helpful. I do see one hand raised from a person that I know. Grace, would you like to ask a question? You want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Supper. How's it going? I guess, so of course the fight for kind of name change policy certainly isn't over, but I think there's a lot of momentum in this field, moving towards maybe even using ORCID IDs with a reference to a name. That sounds like a really, really good goal, but where else do you think we should be putting our efforts in trying to, I won't necessarily say level the playing field, but where do you see effort that should be put next?
That's a really good question. I think within, like STEM and academia in particular, I think now what we're seeing, which I think we're seeing with a lot of diversity incentives, is that there is starting to be, this this gap in individual knowledge, that people are, willing to go to DEI workshops that their department puts on, or they're willing to, yeah, like sort of kind of do the bare minimum. But they're being introduced to these like very sensitive and complex topics like bathroom access, like, hormone replacement therapy, like access to, healthcare and resources, for certain trans folks, for trans women in sports. And I think that, I'm seeing a lot of folks who, in an effort to want to contribute to the conversation, don't take the time to educate themselves first. And I think that, what I would really like to see is more ally-led efforts within academic spheres to educate themselves, so that trans people are not exclusively doing the education. And I think that what that means is putting money at it, hiring a professional, because then, at least if you're talking to a trans person who then can educate you on the ways in which, you can start to dismantle your own biases with gender and start to support trans folks in your, workspaces, that if they are trans and you do offend them, that they're also making money. Yeah. But I think that, yeah, what it feels like there's a lack of is cisgender spaces in which people are talking out the things that they're confused by, so that, when they emerge from those, that they emerge being able to support their trans colleagues without making their colleagues work for it.
Great, thanks for the question and the thoughtful answer. We have a question from Finn. Finn, go ahead.
Hello. Hello, how are you doing today? Thank you for that talk. That was great. I don't know why my video is not starting. Sorry. But I love the fact that I love that hiring out, because it also, if the person is trans and the employee, that it's a messed up power dynamic that's happening. My question is that I've been a part of a bunch of DEI stuff, and a mandatory DEI in trans and other issues, and I've come across a problem where, even though it's mandatory, people like it's problematic because people aren't open still. So and they think that they've done the class, and I'm just wondering if you have any ideas around that. I mean, I guess that's kind of a big question, but yeah.
No, I think that's a good question, because I think that, especially in academic spaces, that, professors and graduate students are so strapped for time that they see any sort of additional mandatory anything as being, infringing on that time. And so, I've seen, mandatory DEI workshops where, we're talking about, intrinsic biases in the experience of students of color, and professors of color, that, people are like reading papers, because, and I think that, it's kind of a two-pronged challenge, because I think that, I don't think it's the job of the person that's experiencing oppression to convince someone who holds power to care. I think that it's those that are at the same level as them are the ones that need to care. And so I think that really identifying individuals who, are in positions of power, who do care strongly about these things, that they should be the ones standing next to you to help move that bar. There was we had a really interesting experience, not around training around, Trans 101, but doing anti-racist training, there was a group that formed in my graduate department of that was a space for non-Black students and non-Black professors to come together and discuss personal anti-racism work. And at first it was all graduate students and one professor, but then that professor pushed hard to make sure that other professors went. And it was a small enough group that it was very obvious if your participation, or if you weren't participating, or you weren't doing the readings that were required. And honestly, that kind of peer pressure is helpful, because even if someone doesn't believe that, maybe they don't believe in DEI, or they don't believe in equity, or, they don't feel like they have the time for it, like putting them in a space where they know that they will be, that they will be held accountable for the things that they say, at least will get them to be quiet. And honestly, like at a bare minimum, getting those people to stop sharing their problematic opinions is a good step in the right direction. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. I realized that I hadn't muted myself, and you probably heard me. That's hilarious. I love the fact that, just getting them to, practice being quiet. That's really a good first step. Thanks for that idea. I love it. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, on that vein, like anybody who has ever interacted with a non-binary person, like you're going to mess up, right? Like that is the whole point, is that we are actively attempting to reprogram the ways in which society has formed our view of the world. And so mistakes are inevitable, and that, you're not a bad person for making those mistakes, but you are a good person for continuing to pursue, equity despite making mistakes. I think that it can be, it does feel discouraging, but also, I think it's a helpful reminder to know that the sun does not, shine out of your where, and that you are a flawed person that needs to, that needs to put in work to change in order to be a better person. It's not just going to come from existing.
I had a quick question related to something that you said earlier on, which had to do with your experiences in terms of the feedback you got when you, had a female name and a female appearance, and versus a male name and a male appearance, right? And all of that. I guess I was curious whether you had thoughts on, because it's a different issue, but like it's not that different, right? It still has to do with assumptions that are made about people based off of whatever society has decided about particular genders or gender identities. And I guess I just wondered whether you had thoughts about ways that could be addressed, or ways that people who might be in those groups may be able to push back a little bit. Like, I just wondered if you had any ideas about that.
That's a good question. And I think I really liked I'm going to steal that quote from Finn, the try silence. And I think that a really great tool that an ally can have is learning to listen. And that any sort of, you can observe a person, and you can form an idea of maybe like what they like to wear, what they refer to themselves as, whatever. But that's, that might not be accurate, because someone might feel uncomfortable dressing a certain way at work because they're afraid that people won't take them seriously. I think that that's a really common experience of cisgender and transgender women, or just feminine people, right? That in academic spheres, like femininity is targeted. It's not seen as intelligent. It's not seen as you know, professional, all of those things. You know, and I think that as you, you know, sort of learn more about the ways, you know, I mean, I think that basically if you're acting like anything other than a, like, you know, professional suited male, like you run the risk of being discriminated against. And so, you know, I think that, that, you know, in sort of addressing those sorts of things, you know, like within your professional work setting, I think a really important thing to keep in mind is like, the goal is to not reprimand somebody. The goal is to make your colleague feel supported. And so you shouldn't assume that like jumping in and being like, hey, don't tell her she has to wear a dress, like, you know, or, you know, whatever iteration of that is, you know, to not assume that that's the way that the person wants to be supported. You know, and so like, I think great opportunities to have discussions about that are, you know, with like, say like a gender minority group, or like a gender minority affiliation group, you know, where you can talk about, you know, like, hey, like, yeah, if someone says like, if someone makes a comment about my heels, like, I want you to like tell them to go like screw off. And you're like, okay, cool, I can do that, easy. You know, but again, like if you encounter a situation where, you know, you see something that you think might have made your colleague uncomfortable, like asking them about it, like, hey, that was kind of a weird thing that happened in group meeting, you know, like, is there a way you would want me to handle it later? Because like, I want to support you because I think that what so-and-so said is not appropriate. You know, really coming at from a like supporting the individual lens, and then still following up, right? You can't just say, you know, wow, like, okay, I will talk to, you know, like Eric having a problem with you wearing a pink t-shirt, you know, and then not actually going and talking to Eric about it, right? Like, you gotta like actually follow through. And I think that, you know, that's looks very different for professors and graduate students. But, you know, I think that a way of also addressing this is to move beyond hierarchies. You know, I think that students can support professors, and that professors can support students, and that professors can support each other, you know, and to not assume that the only transgender people in your department are the undergrads or are the graduate students. You know, they're staff and they're your colleagues, and, you know, they could be anybody at the university. You know, and so to paying attention to, you know, those individuals, and following up with them in particular, as the starting point of catalyzing change, I think is key. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded.
Well, I don't see any further questions, but thank you again, Irving, for sharing your contact information. If folks would like to follow up with you with some more questions, that's really helpful. And I see that we're about at the end of our hour here. It went by really fast. So I just want to thank you again on behalf of CSSM and all of our sponsors for this really wonderful presentation and discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to our sponsors once again, the School of Arts and Sciences, the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, as well as the LGBT Center, who have helped to put this together. And again, if you are local to Penn Chemistry, room 528, Chem 73, there is baked goods. So come on over and come visit. And we're going to celebrate all the great contributions of the LGBT plus community in STEM. So thank you for being here.